This is so great to see so many old friends and new friends and people I don't even know. Thank you all for coming out. This is great. Again, on such a cold night. I was telling Stephanie earlier that this morning when I left, I basically came down my quarter to half mile long driveway sideways because it's on the north side of the mountain and still just covered with ice. But here I am. So some of you I know have had this book and read it, and others of you haven't. And some of you know my earlier work, Sodom Laurel Album, A New Road. Both of those books are pretty documentary in nature, and this book is far different than that. And I'll talk a little bit about that here, but what I'm going to do, I'll tell you, this book is complicated even for me. And so putting together a talk about this book was really challenging, figuring out what to do. So I'm going to be doing some reading from the book, both from the journal entries as well as the fictional component. I think you'll be able to tell the difference. And then I'm going to end up with primarily a series of photographs on our recent catastrophe here in the mountains. I spent a lot of time photographing in Marshall for the first 6 weeks after the storm, and I'm now trying to figure out what to do with that material, whether I add that to this book. Anyway, I'll get to all of that in the reading, and I hope you'll enjoy this. The truck stopped, and the stillness woke the boy. They'd been driving all night, one of many dark of the moon trips over the last few weeks, avoiding people, stealing fuel when they could find it to steal, sleeping during the day after hiding the truck, a pistol tucked in the floorboard. "Where are we, Papa?" the boy asked. Frank said nothing. He was weary from the road and wary of what they might find. Had he decided right? Would they be safe in the surreal and desolate landscape? Could they survive here? He'd seen outlines of collapsing houses and barns as he drove, but no signs of life, no lights, no smoke, nothing stirring. He wondered, are we the only ones? "We can't drive any farther," he said to Wright. "The road is blocked, and it looks like the bridge is caved in. I'll tell you about this place as we walk." So begins my third volume in a trilogy of books from Madison County, North Carolina, and the mountains northwest of Asheville. Little Worlds follows Sodom Laurel Album, published in 2002 by the Center for Documentary Studies and UNC Press, and The New Road, published in 2009 by the Center for American Places and Columbia College Chicago. Little Worlds is an experimental work that intertwines three separate but interrelated narratives: photographs and journal entries from my 50 years in Madison County, and speculative fiction set 50 years in the future. My intent with Little Worlds was quite simply to do something different. I wanted to break from the documentary model I had followed from the first two books and explore the relationship between documentary fact, and fiction. I'm sorry. Okay, there we go. I got it. Winter 2019. Yeah. When I moved to the North Carolina mountains in 1973, this barn with a message printed on its face, "Get right with God," was a prominent sight driving west on the Marshall bypass. It was impossible to miss. This is the first picture I made in Madison County and one of my earliest memories of the place. Now, 46 years later, all that remains of the barn and its attachment are this photograph and the story I've clipped to it. It's the same for the other photographs and stories in this box, artifacts of a particular time and place, part real, part not, products of memory, journals, and imagination. I've now come to accept and appreciate that message, get right with God, in a different light. It remains fundamentalist and apocalyptic and has a certain or else undercurrent, but I interpret it to mean being at peace with oneself and with one's own notion of God. As I look back at the stories and images of this life I've created, I might ask, am I right with God? Have I lived righteously? And what of the world itself? What went wrong and what brought society to this point of collapse? Were we not right with God? I didn't expect to be in this place as long as I have, but here I am. I married Leslie and raised my two children. Raised my two children, Ben and Kate, and discovered and lived a life here. And as they were growing up, I told my children stories, mostly at bedtime, about my life before moving to the mountains, as well as memories of my time here. And together, we created fictions set in the past or a different future. These stories were as much invention as real, a curious blend of fact and fantasy. One story I told Kate, or I imagine I told her, envisions our community in a future time, decades from now, when the world is a much different place. The land and people are familiar. Their story is the stuff of life, food and warmth, security, how we communicate and spend our time, and our hopes and fears, and how we define a life that is at once foreign yet hidden in our memories. It's a story that we are still writing. I'd originally titled this work Shatter Zone, which I always interpreted to mean a place of refuge and resistance. And Madison County, really signifies that for me. Winter in 1973-74. There are other people like me moving here, buying land and trying to make a living in whatever way possible. What's brought us here? Rebellion is part of it. People seeking slow and small are looking for solace. Others are running away, wanting to start over, and some are preparing for some imagined apocalypse. We've all come to a place where ideas of refuge and resistance to the outside world are ingrained in the local culture. There's a history of self-sufficiency here, and in that sense, the new people, with their rejection of mainstream culture, are just learning and building on that tradition. After a time, I realized that Shatter Zone was insufficient as a title because for me, and for many of us who have moved here, it was also a place of rebirth and renewal. When I heard Stan Hyatt, the resident engineer of the I-26 project, say he thought people would still have their little worlds after the coming of the road, I knew I had the title that I wanted. With the journal entries, I tell my own story of moving to the mountains and the life I created. The fictional component tells a similar story of people resettling the community after a worldwide collapse. Family, work, play, good and evil, religion, spirituality and faith, politics and landscape, darkness and light, memory are among the themes presented in this book in all three narratives. Frank and his son, Wright, begin to rebuild the old home place that Frank knew from childhood visits with his grandparents. They find photographs and writings stored in an old trunk in a crawl space below the house, which seem to tell a story of place and time, a happy time and a thriving place. They found other people resettling the area, many drawn here from memory or instinct or need. Soon the group began working together in an attempt to form something new. That night, around the central fire, after a meal of roast deer haunch, potatoes, and wild greens, Kay, the older woman who had arrived with the family, stood up. She was small and looked frail enough to be blown over by a random gust, but her lined face and straightened posture gave off an air of wisdom and certainty. She began talking in a manner the boy had trouble understanding. I remember when I was a young'un, like these young'uns here, when my kin and neighbors would gather of an evening and sing and tell them stories. Some of them stories was real, and some was made up, and us young'uns couldn't tell which was which. My family all had different beliefs about things, politics, religion, everything, and we were known to quarrel about them. But when we started telling them stories, our differences seemed to vanish. I love the mountains, and I didn't want to leave, Kay continued. It was the best place in the world to grow up, and I wanted to raise my young'uns here around my family. But there was no work, and so we moved south to Florida. Things changed. When we bought our house in Florida, we had drainage canals that kept the community dry, even though we're only a few miles from the ocean in one direction and close to a swamp in the other. But the storms got worse and more frequent, and those canals couldn't keep up. Our neighborhood got so it was underwater more than it was just close to it. Soon the roads deteriorated and basic services all but stopped. Most of the people I worked for just moved somewhere else. 2006 to 2008. There we go. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna need some help here.
You don't know what just happened.
Sure.
There we go. All right.
All right, let me just do this. Skip over some pictures. Okay. We need to get back on the,
Yeah.
this one?
Mm-hmm.
Which one? Okay, there we are. I'm sorry. I've been in one of my existential funks lately, asking if I want to continue doing what I've been doing for the past 30 years. Friends counsel patience and taking time to recharge. And I admit it would be nice to be able to hole up in my dark place out of sight. I've been to 3 or 4 community meetings in the last couple of months dealing with new housing developments in Madison County. I've got to believe this mad rush is happening partially because of I-26, which has been open for 5 years now. The county has been discovered by a new group of people. A gated community is planned in Spring Creek, which is remote. Sorry, this is really. Okay, I'm back. Which is remote and seems an unlikely spot for a development. When asked about it, the developer says defensively, "We're not trying to create new markets. We're responding to what's already there. It will have green spaces," they say, and the gates are for security. Another 680 spread in Spilcorn, also gated, is to be called Trust Highlands. When questioned about water and erosion issues, One backer of the project says defensively, if you don't like what's going on here, you should just move. Later, in the fictional component of the book, after a major confrontation with a group of bandits, the community comes together at a gathering. Once again, Kay, the community elder, speaks first. Most of you know my story, she began. It ain't much different from yours. We've come from a bunch of different places, but we're all wanting the same thing, to live peaceably. And now, she continued, raising her hand above her head, we've washed this land in blood to keep it. Killing those men was the right thing to do. In my mind, there ain't never been but two things worth fighting for, land and family, and we've just fought for both. Frank stood slowly. Everybody quieted to hear him over the sound of rain on the roof. We don't own this land, he began. It belongs to none of us and to all of us. We only get to take care of it for a short time. I've heard talk from some of you about not wanting certain people in the community because of their differences, their color, or their manner. I think we have to leave that way of thinking behind us. We're survivors of that world, and all have landed here. We've already seen what we can accomplish when we work together. Protect one another, share what we have. That's the world I want. Fall 2015. I start driving, and in 3 days I find myself here, Martin, South Dakota, 1,500 miles from home. I knew it would take that distance and more to think clearly about where I've lived and what I've been doing for the last 42 years. I know the positives of my home place as well as the negatives. It has been a perfect spot for me, but lately I felt nothing but over it, and I want it behind me. My old voice is seeking a new voice. I know from my reading and my work that Indigenous peoples had a connection to the land and the world around them that was different from that of white people. I sense that link has more to do with an appreciation of the sacredness of the earth, a purity of vision, and less to do with ownership. I think about the spirit of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and I wonder if there might be answers for me here. I drive west through the Dakotas to Wounded Knee, the Black Hills and Devil's Tower. In the Badlands, I pitch my tent in a 50-mile-an-hour wind and struggle to warm food and tea. When I'm cocooned in my sleeping bag, the wind whips through my tent in gusts that physically move me. I think, this trip has nothing to do with me or Crazy Horse. It's about surrendering to the wind. I head north to the Little Bighorn Creek, my emotions still with the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples protecting their homeland and their way of life. At the battlefield, my mind shifts to the plight of the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry. Most were immigrants, Italians among them, new to the country, poor, barely speaking English, signing on to the army in exchange for regular meals and a paycheck, and the beginnings of assimilation. The irony is palpable. These oppressed refugees from Southern Europe, fleeing their own poverty and war, arriving in a new land where suddenly they became the oppressors and dying violent deaths because of it. I think if my grandfather had migrated 40 years earlier, this could have been him. Spring 2016. I go through the garden with the weed eater. It's easier today for some reason. No yellow jackets or aching back. And as always, the mowed tiers offer something tangible, evidence of work done. Afterwards, still coated with grass clippings from the waist down, I sit on the deck with sweet tea and a smoke. It's windy, trees bowing with the gusts and loose limbs hitting the ground. I hear the gang of crows that have been parked in the holler for the last couple of weeks. They're persistently vocal today, as if having an argument. I scan the tree line, trying to sight them, but see only green. I look to the sky, a flash of red tail chased by darting streaks of black, the age-old dance between hawk and crow. Higher, there is a breaststroke jet trail, topped by a crescent moon. I will always be a person who ain't from around here. I've sometimes wished it was different, that I was a local, but I know it's for the best that I'm not. If I had been born here, I'd have the knowledge of place that comes with the lineage, something I've often regretted not having. But had I been born to the culture, I likely would have not created the life that I have. Why I would not have made the pictures I've made or written the stories I've told. And I've accepted that. I remind myself often how much I love it here. Lately, I've begun to think of my photographs as fictions. Yes, they offer specific information about place and time, the textures of life, and they spark our memories. But they also are incomplete, offering nothing of the taste and the smell and the feel of the real thing. And with age, photographs mean different things for the different people who see them. Only the photographer knows the truth of the situation, and even that is fading in my memory. The community continues to evolve, and over time, communications improve between the farms, and they build a small school for the children and a community center. At the opening of the community center, Wright and Hayden, a young woman in the community, hang the photographs they had first found in the truck. Kay found a picture of herself standing in a field in front of a tree. Lord, I'd forgotten about that picture. I used to like to get gussied up. That was my granny's 90th birthday party. I think we moved down south to live right after that party. The man that made that picture was a good friend of my granny's. I knew him from when I was little. He was always around, making them pictures. Kay paused, still gazing at the pictures of a young her. Seeing these pictures now, so many years later, she said, it makes me kind of want to cry for the memory of that time. But they also make me smile as I look around and see what we are building here. Wright and Hayden and I have been looking at the pictures while reading the journals at night, but seeing them together on the walls offered a more complete view, both wonderful and hard. This was our history, and we were adding to it, Wright thought. But when I looked at the pictures, the people, the landscape, the stories, it was with the knowledge of the missing history, the times yet to come for the people in these pictures. Years of hardship, fear and isolation, punctuated by violence, disease, and starvation. On Friday, September 27th, the French Broad River crested at 27 feet, 4 feet more than its previous high in 1916. While most of Madison County was left remarkably untouched, except for minimal power and cell outages, the two river towns, Marshall and Hot Springs, were inundated and mostly destroyed. Once the water receded, every building in Marshall had over 8 feet of water in it. And once the water receded, they were left with 1 to 2 feet of noxious, heavy mud. Our town had overnight become unlivable. Initially, for me, my Catholic guilt kicked in, and I was sure that my speaking of a worldwide collapse in my book had brought on the flood. I could hear myself in confession. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 50 plus years since my last confession, but these are my sins. I wrote a book, Father, and I talked about a great flood, and it came to be, and this flood happened, and it destroyed a town and ruined people's lives, and that is my sin. And after I thought about that for a while, I realized that unlike unlike the government in Marjorie Taylor Greene's imagination, I could not control the weather. Um, I did, however, think it was incredibly weird, strange, prescient that after publishing a book 3 months earlier that speaks of a worldwide collapse, we get a region-wide catastrophe, the likes of which has never happened. It certainly seemed to me that life was imitating art. I was holding out hope as I waded through the mud and standing water in the warehouse where I'd stored 450 copies of Little Worlds. I found the pallet of books turned over, resting in a muddle of water and muck. The covers, front and back, were almost new, but they were all waterlogged, sealed shut, and impossible to open. I've since relocated them to my barn. Let's see, there we go. I've always thought of myself as a participant observer. Throughout my 51 years here, I've been engaged in county life as much or more than I've documented it. My participation fuels my observation and vice versa. Losing the books has helped me understand how much of a participant I am. And while I still ain't from around here, I certainly am of here. These are some of our townspeople and volunteers that have been working in Marshall for the last 3 months now. I've thought about this event a lot since it happened. One of the things that struck me immediately was just the volunteers and the young people who are still there, still working, helping out where they can. One cannot have been raised Catholic or live in Baptist country now and not think about Noah and the biblical flood. And so I have to ask, was this our get right with God moment? Did we not live righteously? Or was Helene this random freak of nature storm that devastated most of the western third of our state? Was it simply our turn for such a catastrophe, much like we've seen in other parts of the world? Paradise, California, Maui, Gaza, Ukraine, and now Los Angeles. The levels and the intensity of these collapses in various little worlds around the globe is truly stunning when we think about it. This is the fourth hurricane flood event that I've photographed in the last 20 years. Katrina, Hugo, Floyd, and now Helene. I've been struck by the similarities, the mud-caked streets and houses, the piles of stinking, rotting debris, the looks on people's faces. Our region has been known for many years as a climate haven. Many of us moved here knowing that the mountains seem to be immune to major natural disasters. We will not be saying that anymore. Among the destruction, the mud, the stinking debris, the soaked insulation and sheetrock, the total disorder, I find beauty and a sense of order. Elegant light, a crooked path across an open floor, wind, my shadow with my books imprinted on my chest. And I think about Shatter Zone, that place of refuge and resistance. And Madison County remains that place for me. But the county in recent years has begun a rebirth, a reinvention as a lively, creative, open, and musical place. The flood will be a major test of that rebirth. Marshall will rebuild, be reborn again, and renewed in ways we don't yet know. But what I know is there is energy and desire and youth. People remember what the place was the day before the flood, and they want that back. As for the book, I think I can assure anyone that owns one of the 550 undamaged books that you now own a rare book. Thank you. Good.
So, any questions? If you're here in person, please raise your hand. Yes.
Well, that's easy. Go ahead.
Just a question about one of the photographs. There was a photo of a woman standing beside, I believe, a church with a cross on it.
Yes.
Wall, and it looked like there was a water line in the middle of the photo. Was that there was a color difference?
That would have been the water line in the building. Yeah. Yeah, there's a number of photographs. I didn't point it out, but there's one of Josh early on where you can really clearly see the water line on the side of the jail, along with a marker that shows where when the old flood happened in 1916 and now the new one. So yeah, that's what that was. Yeah, Alice.
Were there any pieces of disaster response that you saw that you did not anticipate in your book, or anything about the disaster that you did not anticipate in your book? Like, you know, your book is about the disaster.
Yeah, but I'm very, in the book, I'm really vague about what the specific disaster is, you know, and I think that I was intentionally vague because I personally feel like this idea of a collapse is going to happen multidimensionally, you know, and it's going to be different in different parts of the world. The end result is essentially going to be the same, you know, will be a world of refugees, you know, looking for a little world to camp out in. Yeah, I mean, you know, I thought long and hard about that, about how specific I needed to be with that, and I really felt like, okay, just be totally vague. So that was a good way to get out of it. Martin, yeah.
And you're kind of weaving between your diary and the written word of the book. It seems like you're questioning your years of photography and where you want to be and what comes next. And then you have this book, and then this major event happens. How are you feeling? How are you resolving that within either your book or yourself on that sort of thing, or in your photography?
So I've been had the, you know, I mentioned my existential funk. I mean, I have those pretty regularly, you know, where I am questioning what I'm doing, what I have been doing, why am I doing this, you know, all of that kind of thing. And you know, I usually, it takes me time, but of really isolating myself to come to some resolution of that. So that's not unusual for me. I think that in writing this book, this was like a 7 to 8 year project, you know, to really get this thing out and published. And then 3 months later to lose half of the press run was a bit of a shock. At the same time, in a lot of ways, I feel more committed now, you know, and just again, some of the photographs that I've been shooting over the last couple of months are, you know, there's some really good work, and I recognize that that work needs to be seen. So what I'm contemplating is maybe some kind of an addendum to the book. That would be maybe an additional chapter, perhaps. That would be a standalone chapter. So, you know, the book, the journal entries of the book end 4 years ago when Biden was inaugurated. And I think about the various collapses that we have had in the last 4 years for us personally, beginning with COVID, you know, and the impact, not just the deaths that happened in this country, but the way it changed our relationship to time. I think it changed certainly our relationships with our family and friends and all of that. I mean, we had to remake our lives, and then, you know, you throw in a war here or an earthquake there and those kinds of things, and you kind of wonder, like, you know, I mean, it's just happening kind of everywhere. So I had thought, you know, when the book came out and before the flood, I thought, oh, good, I'm gonna have this behind me in the next few months. I'll be able to move on to something else. And then this flood happens, and I realize, okay, you're into this for a whole new deal that's not going away. You know, so, and, you know, and the result of that, I feel like I've been pretty energized. I mean, I really love a lot of the photographs I've been making, which has been, it's not like that hasn't been the case, you know, in the past few years, but, you know, this was consistent over a period of time where a few weeks where I thought, wow.
I like what you said about you're not from here, but of here, and that kind of.
Yeah, that's been a long time coming, figuring out that. Because, yeah, I mean, I still hear you ain't from around here. And it's kind of like, you know, yeah, you're right, I'm not, but I think I've paid my dues. I've left my footprint, you know, so.
Also a bit about that, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but participatory volunteer or observation.
Yeah,
What was that?
participant observer.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and that's been kind of who I've been for the 50 years I've been here. So it's not, you know, certainly to start, I mean, I help neighbors, I cut a lot of tobacco, picked a lot of tomatoes, as Laura will tell you. And, you know, did a lot of that kind of work, just helping neighbors and helping people in the community. And that gradually moved on to become, you know, part of the Arts Council board and doing other community-minded thing, you know, teaching classes in the high school or middle school, that kind of thing, you know, and just being part of the community. And again, that participation, you know, it was kind of interesting, you know, when the flood happened, there's a place out on the Marshall bypass, this business called Nanostead, and they build tiny houses, and that's where they set up the huge collection center and the volunteer center, and that was the staging ground for work in Marshall. And so I was out there one day and I was talking, and this young woman was helping me get a respirator or something with some boots, and she says, "Oh, you know, you took pictures of my granddaddy years ago, and I have some of those pictures." And I was kind of like, okay, this what is that telling me? You know, yes, you're not from here, but you are of here. Yeah, Gary, yes.
I wonder if you'd speak just for a second on your first book to this third trilogy book. I'm thinking of the picture of Brazilla and in Sodom Laurel, the great work you did there, and just speak about the evolution where we got to 2 weeks before the flood. It must be such an amazing transformation you've seen in all those years since the 70s.
You know, Marshall, when I arrived in Marshall, 73, Marshall was thriving. I mean, it was just bustling. You know, there were 3 car dealerships in Marshall. There was, you know, 3 grocery stores, a funeral home, an incredible number of attorneys. You know, the jail was there. You know, just I mean, it was a happening place, and all of that without being able to buy liquor. I mean, you know, but you could. I mean, you could walk downtown Marshall and there you would be bumping into people. And this was in 73, 74, 75. And then, like many Southern towns, I worked for a nonprofit farm advocacy organization for a couple of years, and I visited a lot of small Southern towns. And in the 80s and early 90s, most of those places were dying. You know, and a lot of them had been, the towns had been bypassed, just like the Marshall bypass came in and bypassed the downtown area. I seem to want to hit that. And so they were dying. So, you know, I watched the town die, and then suddenly, you know, kind of 20 years ago, or it's more and more new people came in, more and more new people who had money, and also a lot of the owners of the buildings of downtown Marshall were dying, and their children didn't want to run the business, or they didn't want to hang on to the building. So those things were available. People came in, bought them, and had this vision for doing new things, whether it was with the old bank building or the county jail or whatever. And Marshall, again, the day before the flood was amazing. I mean, it was an amazing place, and in many ways very similar to the place I arrived in 73, and yet totally different, you know, with a whole new demographic primarily. And so for a lot of us that live there now, you know, yourself included, you know, I think we're all interested in, okay, what's next? How are we reborn? How do we experience this rebirth and renewal? And I'm not sure that we know all the answers to that yet. I mean, I think we know some, but not all of them. So, but being fortunate enough to be there for as long as I have, kind of witnessed this evolution, and you know, it's really pretty remarkable, and just the changes that I've seen. So, but yes.
From the 70s, I'm curious about what it was like for you yourself, and you as a group. You were all quite changed. You had some of the change the world culture going on. Then it all comes to a place like Madison County. You were kind of the vanguard of that. It sort of repeats itself in this area. There's all these idealistic generations of people coming to this area. What was it like back then? The dynamic of, you know, I imagine you all quite progressive, but then coming to a place where you said land and family were the things worth fighting for, which is actually quite traditional.
Right.
And yeah, quite traditionally conservative. So what that was like back then.
Well, it was very clear that I ain't from around here. I'll say that, you know, back in 73. I mean, it was I had never been in a place like Madison County. Or I guess I had been in places like that, but never lived in a place like that.
So
Go-
what was the thing that attracted somebody like or US group to such a traditional place with all the values that I imagine you must have all had back then?
So I had an uncle who had bought land there, and I was living in Arizona at the time in Tucson. I was a conscientious objector, so I was doing my alternative service there. And that ended, and I didn't want to stay in the Southwest. I was ready to move back east. And I'm fond of saying that I missed humidity. Uh, but I moved back, and my uncle had invited me. And I had always had a kind of a love affair with the Southern Mountains, I think, from when I was a little kid. I mean, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone stuff. So my understanding of a place like Madison County was all based on Walt Disney's imagery, which I find a curious introduction to the place, and when I got here, I found that, boy, it's not like Walt Disney depicted it at all. It was totally different. And so figuring out how to navigate in the community was difficult. And the way for me to do that best was to learn how to cut tobacco, learn how to pick tomatoes, and help neighbors do that. And then you do that, you get invited over to eat. You invariably get invited to go to church, and you have to navigate that for if you're not a churchgoer, which I wasn't. And how do you explain to people that I don't do that anymore? But they'd still invite you back to eat, and especially because they knew you would be there to help them. And so that's how I did it. And then and I like to think that we still have quite a few local friends, although I know, over the last, again, 10, 15 years, 20 years, I think we've started feeling with the changing demographic in the community that I'm recognizing that, okay, I really, in a lot of ways, have more in common with this new group of people that are moving in. They're much more like me in a lot of ways. I mean, we have similar interests and things like that. So that's who I tend to kind of be with anymore. But I'm not sure I answered that, but
Oh, that's interesting.
okay.
Um,
Any more?
Can you talk a minute, Rob, about the importance of fiction in this book, and do you find that more freedom and the ability to imagine and to create worlds?
So I'd never written fiction before in my life. As I said, I really wanted to do something different. I was so tired of the documentary model. I wanted to do the photographs and I wanted to write, in a nonfiction way, but the idea of doing a bunch of oral histories and doing all that again was just not what I wanted to do. So I started thinking again about those stories that Kate and I used to tell to each other, and started thinking, okay, well, that's kind of an interesting idea. And so I just started writing the fiction, and man, it was so much fun to write the fiction. It was just so liberating in a lot of ways, freeing. The trick, and I had a lot of help with this, was structuring the book and getting those transitions correct, and moving from one narrative to another narrative voice, and the photographs and how all of that worked was tricky. And that's why it took a long time to do, I think. And again, I had some excellent help along the way. And people just they're giving me advice, that kind of thing. And these were editors and writers and other people who I just begged to read this thing and help me with it. So, but the idea of combining fiction and documentary is not something that happens very often. And I almost would say, if at all, I mean, there's a few books out, but not many. And I would definitely say that there's not any books out there like this and that combine in this kind of way. And it just told the story, all three of my books, even though they're documentary, there's a pretty healthy piece of me in each one of those books. And I don't shy away from that. And so this book, though, takes it to a new level. And I'm comfortable with that. Yeah. So I actually want to do more of that. I'd really like to write more fiction. It's